welcome. My name is Paul Murphy. I'm the director of the Institute of Catholic Studies here at John Carroll University, and this is a joint effort between the Institute of Catholic Studies, the second installment in our annual Catholic Studies lecture series, and we're also working with the Green Chair in Catholic Theology, represented by Professor Ed Hannenberg. Before we move on to tonight's event, I do want to put in a plug for our next events here with Catholic Studies, and actually, again, with the Green Chair. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, this month marks the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. Reformation Day is October 31st. And so next month, November 29th, we will have a speaker on Martin Luther's 95 Theses, which will be presented by Dr. Timothy Wengert, Professor Emeritus at the Lutheran Theological Seminary of Philadelphia. So I encourage you to come back in this ecumenical age to hear more about that topic. Tonight I simply want to say that the occasion for this event is that the Holy Father, Pope Francis, has called a synod for next year on the topic of youth, faith, and vocational discernment. And he specifically asked to hear from young people. The Holy Father wants a church that is more synodal, that is where people gather and talk and walk together and work out what they believe the future of the church is. And so this is our effort to contribute to that. And I will share with you that whereas I'm not going to send to the Vatican the videotapes of tonight's event, the presentations made by our panelists will be forwarded to the Holy Father as if only a symbolic effort to participate in the preparations for the Synod. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Edward Hannenberg of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies as our moderator this evening. Dr. Hannenberg holds 3 degrees from the University of Notre Dame in the area of systematic theology. He also has a minor in sports science. But Ed is actually a very active scholar and an outstanding teacher, and a very generous colleague. I'm glad that he's here to help us continue this conversation. So Ed, I'll turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Murphy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, great. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. As Dr. Murphy indicated, the occasion for this event is the upcoming. It's taking place a year from now, the next World Synod of Bishops, which is a form of consultation that Pope Francis has really reinvigorated in recent years. If you followed Catholic news much at all over the last couple of years, you probably know that the last round of synods, this gathering of bishops from around the world, focused on the family. And it was those were controversial meetings because they brought up a number of taboo topics, such as how is the church going to, how ought the church minister to divorced and remarried Catholics, how ought the church to accompany those families that don't fit into a traditional mold of family life. And it's not so much, I think, that the Pope is looking for a quick change in doctrine or a simple solution to the challenges facing the church, but as I see it, more than anything, what the Pope has been doing is encouraging church leaders to develop a habit of listening, to learn how to listen to the laity, to really listen to married people, to hear their struggles, their desires, to really hear what their lives are like, to meet them where they're at. With the upcoming synod, which, as I said, will take place in October of 2018, the Pope is calling church leaders to listen to young people. And so he's asked the bishops around the world to go out into their dioceses and listen. He's asked young people to speak up, to make their needs known, both to their pastors, their bishops, in whatever way they can within the church. In whatever way, really. There's even an online survey on the Vatican's website. They're really trying to gather information and a sense of what the needs and hopes, dreams of young people are today. So what we've done here at John Carroll tonight is we've gathered 4 outstanding young people. The Vatican is for the purposes of this synod, defining young people as those between the ages of 16 and 29. So I think we've got 4 outstanding young people, all connected in some way to John Carroll, in order to listen and to engage one another. So I hope that this time we have together tonight is conversational. I'll explain the format in a minute, but let me introduce the 4 panelists. Grace Blanchard is a junior, double major in political science and theology and religious studies. She's originally from Twinsburg. And she's been involved on campus in the Arupe Scholars Program, campus ministry, and the Career Center. Grace loves social justice, Disney movies, and according to her, being a delight to all who know her. She really is a ray of sunshine, which is words I promised her I would say. Martin Dober is a grad of Benedictine High School and of John Carroll. He's currently in his 4th year at St. Mary's Seminary in Wycliffe, where he's studying for the priesthood. As an undergrad, Marty helped found the Tolle Lege Summer Institute, which is a program introducing the Catholic intellectual tradition to high school students. He also helped to establish a Cleveland chapter of the Young Catholic Professionals group and currently serves on its board. God willing, Marty will be ordained a priest in May of 2019. Our 3rd panelist is Jarrell Sison, who teaches theology at St. Ed's High School in Lakewood. He's a graduate of the MA program in Theology and Religious Studies at John Carroll. He served as a Jesuit volunteer in Detroit and as Director of Youth and Young Adult Ministries at St. Ambrose in Brunswick. Jarrell is the founder of the online ministry resource, thelivingperson.com. Finally, Jillian Zajac grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, and graduated from John Carroll with a major in Theology and Religious Studies and a minor in Catholic Studies. She got her master's degree in theology from Boston College and came back to Cleveland, serving for the past 2 years as pastoral associate and youth minister at my parish, St. Dominic in Shaker Heights. There she pioneered the first high school agape latte program. She's led retreats and served on numerous domestic and international immersion trips. She now teaches theology and works as a campus ministry at Lake Catholic High School. So join me in welcoming our panel. Thanking them for putting themselves out there, right? For being willing to speak to a large group, mostly of their peers, about their perceptions, their experiences of being a young Catholic. The format tonight is pretty simple. I've got an opening question for all 4 of our panelists, and they'll get a chance to make a very brief opening statement in response to this question. There'll be a chance for them to respond briefly to one another, and then we'll open it up to questions. I've got a bunch of questions, but I hope you have a bunch of questions. So think about the things that you want to say, the questions that you want to ask, and we'll try as much as possible to make this big group a conversation. Okay? Does that all sound good? Sounds good to me. All right. So let me pose a question then to our panelists. And why don't we begin down at the end? The first shall be last. So Jillian will respond first, and I'll ask the others to respond in turn. Speaking out of your own experience and your own work with youth, what do you see as the most pressing needs of young people today? So Jillian?
Thank you, Dr. Hannenberg. And I just want to say it's such an honor to be here in front of all of you. Not too long ago, the seats were reversed. So it is a great honor to be here with mentors and friends at my alma mater. So the most pressing need that I've seen, being a youth minister, being on the other side of it as a youth, and now as a campus minister and theology teacher, is communication, I would say. And that communication is strongly tied to technology when we think about that. Before I go into my own personal experiences, I just kind of wanted to paint a picture of youth, especially in our own country. And when we're saying technology and communication, how do those things go hand in hand? So a recent 2015 study made possible by Common Sense Media was released, and it focused on tweens and teens. And the study aimed to offer a comprehensive picture of the use of media by young people in the United States. And surprisingly, and this struck me, I read this summer and really took it to heart and when I was entering the classroom, it said that teenagers spend about 9 hours a day in front of a screen, and that's excluding screen time in school and excluding screen time used for homework. So 9 hours a day on top of the classroom, on top of homework. And that just made me really think about how we communicate with these people who are on a screen more than they sleep, more than they're in school, more than they're definitely interacting and having one-on-one conversations with parents or friends alike, you know. It's an incredible amount of time a day. And so, as a youth minister, I felt responsible for trying to integrate technology into especially communication. When we think about our Catholic institutes and how we communicate with young people, one of the first great role models I think we think of is Pope Francis. I mean, his Twitter account is all over the place. I see people retweeting it and sharing it on Facebook and whatnot. And it made me beg the question to my own students. I had about 10 students in my office this past week. And I said to them, I said, so how many of you guys have Twitter and whatnot? And all 10 of them did. And I said, all right, how many of you guys follow Pope Francis? I was thinking maybe I get half. You know, I thought that would be a good number. But all 10 did. All 10 did. And I said, okay, let me ask you a question. How many of your parishes have Twitter accounts? And they said none of them, not one. And I said, okay, like, do any of your parishes have Snapchat or Instagram or anything that you guys are on? And they said no. And so I think that Pope Francis provides us an interesting model for how to communicate, that we need to use technology as a medium not only in the wider church, but in more local settings, in our own parishes, by our youth ministers, by our pastors. And I think the Diocese of Cleveland, and particularly, does a really good job outlining these guidelines. When I was just working in the parish earlier this year, they sent videos to all the youth ministers about great guidelines to use for Twitter accounts, Snapchat accounts, things like that. But the question is, are we utilizing it? Can we communicate? And those same students, I asked, well, how do your parishes get in contact with you? Like, how do you know what's going on? And they were like, well, through our parents. And I said, okay, good. I said, well, where do they read it? Like, how do they know? They're like, in the bulletin. And I was thinking that I had picked up a couple bulletins the past couple weeks, and not in one bulletin was there a Facebook username or a Twitter handle or anything that maybe could point that if a young person picked this up, that there was a medium that their parish can communicate with them. Because I don't see many 13-year-olds when I'm on the Sunday picking up the bulletin and thumbing through, you know, like it's the greatest thing in the world. So I think that we have to really ask ourselves, and you know, a big need in the church here is, how are we communicating with our young people?
Great.
Can you hear me? Good. It's amazing, like, I could walk into a class of 30 teenagers that will absolutely hate the experience that they're about to have in my theology class and not be nervous, but like, you come here voluntarily and like my heart is pounding. So I just want to say thank you. I think, from my experience, that the most pressing need for young people today is to be appreciated and to feel appreciated by church leaders. How can the church effectively respond to that need of young people? I want to talk about a couple of things. I want to try to provide some insight on the two generations of the youth, and then I want to talk about how I think the church can reach them most effectively. So the generations in this context, 16 to 29, are millennials and what people are calling Generation Z, for short, Gen Z. As far as the ranges, it's different depending on what source you use, but millennials are those born 1980 through 96. So roughly if you're 20 to 34, and Gen Z is 97 to 2003, so roughly 12 to 18. You know, rough estimations. When I first heard this information, I was pretty skeptical, but hearing some of the information actually rang true to my experience in the classroom and youth ministry with teens, so I started to look into it a lot more. The difference is subtle, but I think it's really, really important. So here are just two differences out of the many. Gen Z, so number one, we're talking about the youngest generation, and technology is their reality. You maybe never thought about this, but if you're a millennial, if you are ages 20 to 34, maybe you can actually remember a time when you didn't have internet. You can actually very distinctly remember a time when like you got an AOL CD for a 30-day subscription of free AOL, and you had to use dial-up, and that was new. So expert marketers are saying that, have this mantra about technology. It goes like this. Tricky. Technology is only technology if you are born without the technology. So Gen Z, like for Gen Z, like a screen isn't technology, it's just reality. It's just their reality. So they were born with internet, and they were born with all the information. They were born with the touchscreen in their hand. I'm telling you this because I think it's so easy for us to kind of demonize the youngest generation because they're always stuck to their smartphone. Some of you guys are on them right now. I'm not trying to demonize you, I'm just trying to appreciate it. I think it's an ineffective and kind of like slippery slope when we're trying to appeal to teenagers. What I found is that it's so incredibly important to adjust the attitude towards young people if we want to be effective in our mission of spreading the gospel. We have to stop viewing the youngest generation with a lens or hermeneutic of suspicion. And we have to start viewing the youngest generation with a lens or hermeneutic of appreciation. So there's an effective practice, and what would that look like? It would just be simply identifying and kind of like fighting and searching for what is good about their lifestyle and practice and culture. We have to find it and dig for it and search for it. And we have to affirm it, appreciate it, and use it to bring more people to Jesus. Frank Mercadante, in his book, Engaging a New Generation, says, we can unleash the incredible energy of this great generation simply by changing the lens in which we view them. Second, most fascinating, is that Gen Z is a post-9/11 generation. Gen Z teenagers have no clue of America that is free of terrorism and war. They have no idea, and through no fault of their own. They were born into it. And beyond that, and more than that, they have been born into an overwhelming amount of cyberbullying, suicides, a heightened awareness of violence, and mass public shootings. And as a millennial, as a 29-year-old, almost getting into their 30s, I can't say that's true of my experience. Like, I grew up pretty sheltered. And I suffered through maybe peer pressure with drugs, but I didn't go to school and hear from my friend that they were struggling with thoughts of suicide. And I didn't experience a mass shooting what seems to be every 2 weeks. And I didn't have to deal with these things that the teens are dealing with now. So again, I think this is important because since this was their environment, since they started experiencing heartbreaking, horrifying suffering at the age of 7 or younger, Gen Z tends to be more experienced in the midst of evil and suffering. And in general, they have an idea. In general, right? Don't get mad at me when I say this. In general, they have a better idea of what to do when people suffer. They have a general idea of how to move and interact. They're like, my students are okay with crying with a community of friends when people are suffering. That didn't exist for my millennial upbringing. So I think that they know how to mourn better than us older generations. They understand why it's so important to be courageous and to speak up in the face of evil because they've experienced so much of it. Closing. How can we reach out to teens in effective ways? My answer is that we church leaders need to stop viewing this generation with so much suspicion and to start appreciating them. because teens are not going to listen if you don't appreciate them. And this isn't new, it's just really challenging. There's so much goodness and beauty and truth that's already present in the generation. We need to affirm it. We need to use it, all for the sake of bringing more people to Jesus.
I'm going to keep up with the technology theme, I think. Maybe I'm going to be a little more critical of technology. I think that technology does a lot of great things for us, but I think one of the side effects of it is that sometimes it distances us from questions of meaning. So we have access to tons of information through technology, but sometimes that makes it harder to go deeper into questions of meaning. So I think we're awake to the capacities and the wonders of technology, but we're kind of asleep to these deeper questions of human purpose. And I think there's some problems that come as a result of that. Tyler Joseph of the band 21 Pilots is pretty aware of this modern failing we have to think deeply about questions of meaning. In one of his songs, he says, "I will try with every rhyme to come across like I am dying to let you know you need to try to think." And I think that's a need for young people today. We have to engage these deeper questions of existence. We're more likely to spend time watching videos of obese cats trying to fit into various containers than we are to go and seek a conversation about what is the purpose of human existence. Those cat videos are hilarious, but they don't contribute to full flourishing humanity, I think, in the same way as a cat video does. Again, like Jarrell, I want to clarify, I'm speaking generally. Obviously, a Jesuit university is a place where questions of meaning do get raised. But I think that one of the needs is for everybody, especially for youth, is meaning. According to Joseph Ratzinger, meaning is the bread which sustains human life. Without it, we starve. And in that note, one of the things that kind of disturbed me recently was a statistic I saw that the second leading cause of death in Americans aged 25 to 34 is suicide. And it's the third leading cause for the 15 to 24 age group. I mean, that alone should give us pause. I know that hurts me to hear that that's the case. And I wonder if maybe some of those people we've lost to suicide, it's because they looked for meaning and failed to find it, and then they despaired. And I think there's a possibility that's the case. One of the things that I'm grateful for is that the church can respond to that hunger and thirst for meaning that each one of us has. And Pope Francis has been known to say on numerous occasions, it is Jesus alone who gives meaning to our lives. And the church is Jesus' body and is tasked with bringing that meaning to the world. So I think that the mission for the church here is kind of twofold in responding to this need for meaning in young people. I think it has to show young people the truth and the love of Jesus. It has to help us know and to feel the meaning and direction that Jesus gives to our lives. And I think the first and most important truth is the love that God has for us in Jesus Christ. And this love upholds each of us constantly, and it went to the cross for us to save us from darkness and to bring us to the light of the resurrection. The church has to communicate this truth to the youth in a way that is accessible and compelling, even using these social media means as necessary, because that's where the youth are. But I think calling them to something beyond merely a use of technology. And I think that failing to communicate God's love is an inexcusable failure for the church. I think the second need for truth that we have is for discernment. That's one of the themes of the upcoming Synod. We're constantly surrounded by many and different competing voices in the media and entertainment. Some fresh words from our new bishop, Nelson Perez here. He says, the great challenge for youth in the world today is hearing God's voice in a noisy and secular world, discerning God's true voice from among the many others. And Bishop Perez says the church has a tradition of spirituality and discernment that the youth are thirsty for. But again, these truths have to be shared in a compelling and engaging way. I think the church can respond to our need to feel the love of God in Christ Jesus by being the community that it's called to be as the mystical body of Christ. And I think this is really important. It goes back to the sense of despair that sometimes young people can feel, the sense of not belonging. Since the 1980s, reported loneliness among adults in the U.S. increased from 20% to 40%. Despite our extraordinary ability to constantly connect with one another on social media, we are lonely. No matter what Facebook may claim, it is not a community, but the church is. We need to feel that we belong within the community of the church. And I think that young Catholics will not stay for long if all their church can offer them is Sunday liturgy. They need something more than that. So to summarize the needs of young people today, I think young people need meaning that can only ultimately come from Jesus. They need to know the truth of his saving love for all and for each, and they need to feel the love of the welcoming community of the church.
Okay. So on a little bit of a different note, I actually have a lot of experience with the LGBTQ community, and for anybody that doesn't know, that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer. And since we're talking about youth and vocation, I wanted to explore what vocational discernment looks like for that community. So recently there's been some controversy around Father James Martin's book, Building a Bridge. It's very good, I recommend it. And he looks at the relationship between the LGBTQ community and the Catholic Church. And he is very sympathetic to how the church has marginalized the LGBTQ community, both historically and currently. But he's really interested in how to restore that relationship. And he says in here, quote, "Among younger LGBT people especially, I find a tremendous zest for the faith. Perhaps this is because, unlike their older brothers and sisters, they have grown up in a society where they feel more comfortable about their sexuality, and so they may feel less burdened by their sexual identity." And he notes that younger LGBT people who are active in the church have a great many gifts which we can celebrate and treasure, end quote. And he's right. 70% of Catholics say that homosexuality is not a choice and that homosexuals should be respected. And while of course we can't base our theology on polling numbers, this does signify a shift in thinking. So what's important is that youth are becoming more comfortable with these conversations about LGBTQ issues. I have lots of LGBTQ friends who are happy with who they are. They aren't ashamed of their sexuality. They don't see themselves as objectively disordered or oriented towards intrinsic evil. And they're happy to be living freely and genuinely. And the church calls all of us to be our most authentic selves through our vocation. But out of single life, married life, and religious life, the LGBTQ community is only accepted into single life. As we know, the church does not recognize same-sex marriage, so married life is out. Religious life is tricky because if an LGBTQ individual were in the closet during formation, they could get ordained. It's happened. But if someone is comfortable and open about this part of their identity, then they're strongly recommended to not pursue religious life, since a vow of chastity would mean something different for them. Because heterosexual chastity is a sacrifice, but for Catholics in the LGBTQ community, chastity is a requirement. So that just leaves the single life, which of course is a wonderful vocation, but my question is, can you really discern a vocation if you never had a choice, and if you never had options? For example, even if you want to be a priest, which is considered the highest calling, if you go to the seminary and say that you want to be a priest, but you've never considered single or married life, then they're going to tell you that you need to go through a discernment process first. We all know and recognize that you need to be able to discern your vocation. But for whatever reason, the LGBTQ community is denied having a real choice in their vocation. You've got two options: the single life or leave the Catholic Church. And of course, I'm not saying that LGBTQ Catholics should not pursue the single life. I'm just saying that the Catholic Church is the universal church, and yet not everyone gets to choose their path within it. Vocations are obviously important, if there's a whole synod about how youth feels about it. And increasingly, the Catholic youth are identifying as LGBTQ, and they aren't ashamed of it. They're out of the closet, and they're becoming comfortable with who they are. Yet, an LGBTQ Catholic youth and a straight Catholic youth have entirely different vocational paths. The straight Catholic has 3 vocations to discern from, and all of them are good and important. but the LGBTQ Catholic is forced into the single life with no choice and really with no other options. So if we're talking about youth and vocation, we need to at least recognize that only some of our youth can really discern their vocation. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to all four of the panelists. And I think what I heard in the conversation here was, in a way, a sort of perspective both from what I would consider sort of dominant youth culture in the United States and what is more dominant than the power of, sorry, can you hear me? Not really. So it doesn't really matter if we can hear you or not. Let me just say that what I heard was, I heard our first three panelists talk about sort of the perspective from the possession of the kind of dominant youth culture in the church, particularly talking about the power of our contemporary culture. And then I think what Grace offered, I think, is a perspective from what has traditionally been a marginalized group of Catholics in general and young Catholics in particular. My question, I sort of maybe to ask the other three panelists, in some ways, some of the issues that you raised in terms of technology is as a challenge, the kind of question: how does the church break through and get its message across? Okay. What Grace sort of raised for me was the question: well, what about when it does get its message across? Is that a message that young people want to hear? And I don't know if you have thoughts on that or how you would respond, or really anyone. I mean, I invite you at this point, if you have a question that you want to raise, or if you want to respond to comments that are made, just raise your hand, and I think I will stay standing and just sort of keep an eye out for any thoughts. But any of our panelists?
I think that the message that the church has is something that Catholics want to hear. Sometimes I don't know if they know that they want to hear it. I do think that definitely one of the failings that the church has been guilty of in the past, and Grace rightly brings up, is kind of this marginalization of the LGBTQ community. Sometimes I think, though, in my experience, that some people in that community don't always know exactly what the church teaches. They hear these strange misrepresentations of the church, and oftentimes very hateful things. So I think that while it's true that often the church is communicating clearly, sometimes it's not, and as a result of that, there's misunderstanding, tension, and anger. So at the end of the day, I think people do want and need to hear what the church has to say. Communicating that can be tricky, and communicating that in a respectful way is important also.
Is your comment or question still relevant?
Question for Jarrell and Jillian. For the most basic and primary Catholic communities we have, the parish and the school, how are we providing for young people to create and form lasting, intimate relationships, specifically friendships, that can last beyond the local community of like a high school or a parish?
I mean, as I'm currently working both as a theology teacher and campus minister, our big concern there is to obviously develop those relationships. Whether it's through traditional formats, which are retreats or immersion or mission trips, our prayer groups, certainly those. But also using this technology, I think that Jarrell and I talked about, as a way to also create these communities and these intimate relationships, maybe with other people that you don't know, but also with your own family members. For example, last Lent I was working at St. Dominic Parish, and during Lent we had an online retreat for both parents and students that they would watch a little video that was based off of the Sunday's Gospel, that asked reflection questions that were definitely about things that we all experience: stress, am I doing the right things with my life? You know, the big why questions that we all ask ourselves. And to ask those questions together as parent and student, rather than the parent coming at the student, well, what are you doing with your life? You know, what's going on with you? How are you dealing with your stress? It was a moment where we tried to create and have families be able to create in their own environments through the use of technology, their own prayer time, their own retreat experience in the house. So that's just an example of a way that we could use this technology that we're talking about to strengthen more intimate relationships, both with people we don't know, but also within our own households.
I think there are a lot of good youth ministry programs out there. There are a lot of good schools out there, and a lot of us have been through Catholic schooling or to parishes, and a lot of us know what's offered. So I think what might be more beneficial is to kind of express what goes in my head when I'm trying to create a lasting relationship, and it's going back to I walk into a room of 25 teenagers that just want me to stop talking, And I was telling my wife earlier, it's amazing how much suffering I put up with for these teens, and it's because I want to dedicate my time and my energy so that they can be appreciated and feel appreciated, so that maybe a one-on-one interaction might happen, and they can kind of ask me, what do you think about this? And there's a space that's created intimately when a teen feels appreciated and loved, and that's really hard. That's really hard to reproduce. So that's kind of why my message for church leaders, what I want people to know is that these teenagers are searching for approval and affirmation, and if they're not going to get it from the church leaders, they're going to get it from Instagram, And that's really important for the church leaders to know. If they're not going to get it from me, their theology teacher, they're going to find it somewhere else, because companies are doing research upon research about how to affirm and tell the teen that they're the hero and it's their own journey and discover yourself. And if it's not going to come from the church, it's going to come from Nike, So that's what I'm really passionate about, is I want to be a part of the movement to tell a teen that they're appreciated and loved. And if I can get there, it's not the appreciation that's the end point. The appreciation is the starting point. If I can let them know that, hey, I appreciate you, I see you, I hear you, I don't agree with you, but I hear you, I hear your frustration, and that's a good enough starting point for us to create a space for God to work.
Yeah, the question in the back, John.
Yes, in line with. Thanks, John.
Hi, everybody. In line with
Don't
Jarrell's.
come up here.
I just want some legroom, In line with Jarrell's comment on Nike as a place to reach young adults today, I have a question regarding the relationship, whether positive or negative, between changing a medium and a message. So if we use as a starting point that whenever you change a medium, the message might change, whether for positive reasons or negative reasons. Take, for example, Nike shoes. When I was a kid, as a millennial, if I wanted to get a pair of Nike shoes from home, I'd go in a catalog, and the message of the shoe wouldn't change. I would be getting the shoe that they would give me. But today, if somebody wants to shop at home for a pair of Nike shoes, they can go online, and they can change the shoe entirely. Instead of just buying red Nike shoes, they can buy red Nike shoes with blue heels and green tongues and yellow laces. So in that case, that could be a positive situation where a medium can change a message. But what if the medium of the church leaders is to communicate in the digital world? I think it would be incredibly negative if the message changed. So what do we do when we change the medium to reach youth and young adults today? And what can we do so that the message of God's love and grace and saving action for humanity isn't like a Nike shoe, which can change colors?
One of the things that I think of about that, obviously, I think most people would agree that the church has to use the social media to communicate its message. And it can do so with some degree of efficiency and effectiveness. But I think that a lot of times what we have to do with social media is let it lead to a personal encounter. Jesus came as a human person, and relationships happen between human persons. So I think that the message can be lost if our only medium is social media. If we start to rely too much on these technologies, then we'll start to lose the personal touch, which God thought was important. And so I think that a lot of times our social media use should lead to personal encounters. Yeah, tell people the message of the gospel on social media, but then invite them to the Bible study tonight at the parish. So I think both those things should go on at the same time, because there is a danger of losing the message in the medium.
And I just briefly to piggyback off of Marty and John, and I think that was a great question, is that we were just talking about intimate relationships and personal touch. And I think that when we think about social media, especially how the church utilizes it now, it seems very much big institution. We just talked about how Pope Francis utilizes Twitter versus do our pastors, do our youth ministers utilize it. And so we need the church to also present those intimate relationships through social media. People that we actually know, that we actually can have a conversation with, that we can communicate with through these mediums. Because as much as I would love to believe that when I send Pope Francis a letter, I'm going to get a phone call maybe 2 months from now, it's very unlikely if I tweet him that I'm going to hear something back. But if I tweet my youth minister, if I tweet my pastor, if I reach out to them through these mediums, again, we have these ways for this personal encounter. So as much as we want youth to create these intimate relationships with the church also needs to want to create those intimate relationships with their own youth through these mediums.
Yes, Father.
Thank you, Doctor. My question is based on an assumption, perhaps directed to Jillian and Jarrell, but I think to all four of the panelists. And the assumption is that young people today, when they talk to a campus minister, a teacher, a seminarian, a senior here at John Carroll, and they start talking about their future, you don't hear much about, I'm discerning whether or not I might be religious, a sister, a brother, or a priest. That's my assumption, that you don't have many people coming to you and saying, I'd like to talk to you because I'm trying to discern whether or not I should enter a religious congregation or go to a seminary. If my assumption is correct, that there are not many people coming to you with that kind of a question, what is going on? Because a religious vocation, and by that I mean to priesthood, religious life, in the past was one of the most meaningful things people could do, and it gave them a sense of identity and that they were appreciated. Today it seems like a religious vocation is not on their screen, to use a metaphor from the technology dimensions to your talk. So I'd love to know what you think is going on, and where have the vocations to religious life and the priesthood gone?
Well, first I'll agree with your point that yes, we don't hear a ton of people talking about discernment. In fact, I think that's probably one of the reasons why one of the goals of the Synod is to talk about discernment, is because I think there is something of a crisis of discernment. At the same time, I think we know from some of the numbers done about religious life and priesthood that there is a little bit of a change in that trend, but I still think it's true that generally speaking, that's a rarer conversation. Just one thing that strikes me is I think that the call to religious life and priesthood is rarer and is heard less frequently because it's a little more countercultural than it used to be. And I think, for example, in the 50s, you had this great boom of vocations. The Catholic Church in America was kind of at a high point in that time, and people were more comfortable with the idea of a church, an established church, and ministry in it. I think that one of the effects of kind of this, the pressure of a new atheism and the lack of participation in religious ceremonies and services is that people don't see that as part of the culture as much. And to do that is something that will kind of lead to some, questioning by your peers and that kind of thing. It wouldn't necessarily be a very popular thing to do, to say, oh, yeah, I'm discerning religious life or priesthood. I mean, you can kind of think about how would you react if you heard somebody say that. You'd be like, oh, okay, because it is uncommon, and I think because it's a little bit countercultural today. So I think that's one feature of it.
I would just add another feature of it is witness. We all know that there's a lack of priests and religious women that are in our schools, that are visible. I know in particular at Lake we used to have a chaplain, but that was years ago, years and years and years ago. So there has been no witness to the young people of the vocation of priesthood, of the vocation of sister or nun to us. And so that leaves them looking toward what's in front of them. I think that we all have chosen maybe our vocations or path in life based off of people that we've known, people that have really inspired us, that have really tugged at our heartstrings. And so if our young people aren't experiencing Mass on a weekly basis, which we know is very much a reality, then where is their interaction with our priests, with our sisters? Because it's very rarely happening in our Catholic schools, especially our diocesan Catholic schools. For example, where I am, we have a football team, like most Catholic schools have a football team, right? And so our football team this year, there used to be a tradition that they would have Mass before each game. And so they really wanted to bring that back and have a Mass before they would go out and play each game. But they ran into a problem when they had Saturday games, and the time would have corresponded much with when parishes have confession right before their vigil masses. And so there was no way by college, many parishes in this diocese to get a Mass on Saturdays for these boys. And not that it should be football's, it should be any sport we could talk about here, that they want to have a Mass and they want to have a witness of someone in a holy vocation, as they all are. But that's just an example of where we're running into these problems of how can we get these interactions with our priests, with our sisters, with our nuns, when they're pulled in a million different directions and there just doesn't seem to be ample time to have these touch points.
That's an insane question. Not insane, but like mind-boggling question that I just never thought about. Like, where has vocation gone in like today's? I've thought about it, but not in that way. And I guess my gut reaction is like, thank God for Pope Francis, because I think like with so much, like when Marty was talking about, it's no surprise that people have experienced negativity or hurt or suffering from the church. Like, maybe I'm willing to say that those years like put it off the map, or like shove the idea of a religious vocation like all the way to the back. Like this is like a sad thing to talk about, like for me, because like like the idea of vocation is so powerful, and like I would be nowhere without it. So when Jillian says witness, like witness is everything. Witness is everything. This like website that we run, the mission, one of the missions taglines that we have is to give people positive experiences of a God-centered life. And we use that intentionally because like, the worst thing maybe we can do is give people negative experiences of a God-centered life. And how many times have you experienced negativity from a church leader? Whether it's like, man, like, could you just be a little bit more patient with me? I'm trying, I'm trying to be a good Catholic, and I just want to be a godmother for my niece coming up. Can you just give me the certificate? Because I am a Catholic, I go to church, but I go to church at my hospital every day because I work on the weekends, So like, again, I think that I wish people could take this like appreciation thing to heart. Like if clergymen and sisters and church leaders could appreciate maybe vocations in a real way, could get back on the map.
If I might just interject something, just to sort of push down your question a little bit further or deeper for the panel, in recent years, the Pew Research Center has drawn a lot of attention to the rise of the nuns, and they're not talking about religious sisters, right? They're talking about nun, N-O-N-E-S, right? The religiously unaffiliated Americans, right? People who, when they're asked on a survey for their religion, mark none. So it's something like a quarter of all Americans now, when asked what their religion is, say nothing in particular, none. Okay, it's much higher the younger you go. Okay, so among millennials, both it's 35% of millennials are religiously unaffiliated. Okay? And so, kind of my question, I'd be interested in sort of the panel's perspective on this. Why is that? I mean, it might be sort of like where the religious locations gone. But my question is, where have the Christians gone? I mean, what is it about organized religion? What are the obstacles when 4 out of every 10 people who are raised Catholic in the United States are no longer Catholic? Why is that? 40% of people who are born Catholic in this country, when asked today, say they're no longer Catholic. They no longer identify as Catholic. What are the obstacles here? What's going on? I mean, from your perspective, in your experience, or anyone, really.
I think for me, I experience this a lot in my work with campus ministry, but I think a lot of youth sort of struggle as they're growing up because, when you're younger, you sort of just have Mass and this community, and, it's great. You go to church every Sunday, you've got, your Sunday school, and, it's just, like, it's fun. You go to Sunday school, and you go to Mass, and you're good. But then, like, once you get older, for me, like, that's sort of when all the rules sort of come in. And I know that a lot of, like, teenagers, and once you get older, struggle with the, like, contraceptive rules, and with, like, women in the Catholic Church, the stance on the LGBTQ community. And those are valid issues, and I think that they just struggle within the church hierarchy with not feeling heard. And I do think that the Catholic Church has answers to those questions that they're trying to provide. But, since it's so sort of top down, it's like, okay, like, I'm a woman in the Catholic Church, but I don't feel heard. Like, what do I do? And it's sort of hard to find a connection for that. It's like, who do I even go to? And also that, and this is touchy, but, with the youth, we sort of grew up, like, with the sexual abuse scandals. And I know that especially for, like, some of my friends from different communities, like, that was a really, like, strong deterrent, And also back to where have the vocations gone? That sometimes now it's like, oh, like, I'm going to the seminary, and it's like, oh, God, like, there's, like, weird stuff going on. And I think that that's something that we can very easily sort of get past. Like, that's a myth that we can easily debunk. But I feel like the Catholic Church sort of doesn't want to get into that, and they don't want to deal with, like, the nitty-gritty. So I feel like there's just a lot of sort of simmering of issues. It's like, what's going on with, like, gay people? What's going on with birth control? And, we just don't really know how to make all of that heard up at the top so that we can actually affect change.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that. I think the sexual abuse crisis is a big part of the decline in vocations and in believers. I think that is, one specific case of what I would call a larger reason, and that's people seeing hypocrisy in religious institutions. And when I first started hearing that as the response for why people were leaving religion, it shocked me. Like, I'd ask people, oh, so why don't you go to church? Why have you stopped becoming Catholic or whatever? I expected to hear, like, well, I have these objections to the proofs for God's existence and the primacy of the Catholic Church. No, it's I see all these people who claim to be believers, who claim to be Catholics, who live in a way totally other than what a Catholic or a Christian should live. So in my experience, a lot of times the young people especially are attuned to that hypocrisy and reject the religion that seems to be full of hypocrites.
It was interesting that when Father Cousins posed his question, I immediately thought of Dr. Hannonsburg's question in my mind, that the question, of what about priesthood, what about religious life? The question I most asked is, Catholic, really? Not so much? And I've only been in my high school for about a couple months now, since the fall, and I think I've been asked that question 5 times, probably, by students, which I consider a lot in just a couple months, meeting someone that, is just your theology teacher that you've never met before. As a matter of fact, on my first day in the school, they had a day where students could just come in, if you were new, a transfer, walk around. And I met one of my students who came in for my period, and I'm just so excited. It's my first day, and I'm making a positive impression. And I was like, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And she goes, "I'm atheist. Don't talk to me." And I was like, "Oh, well, that's okay." But I said, "You'll just bring where you're coming from, and I'll bring where I'm coming from." I'm like, "And we'll find spots in the middle to meet in. It will be great." And I will tell you, from just not shutting her down, I think, or just not trying to have a conversation right out the bat that's trying to persuade or convince or whatnot, that particular student has been in my office many times this year, crying, as Darrell has said, that he's experienced in his school too, to just asking questions. To go with what Grace brought up at the beginning, what does the church think about LGBT youth? What does the church think about this? And so we have to just be open to those questions. And I think that's been the biggest thing that I've learned when we're dealing with youth who are not necessarily going to church on Sundays. And we have to, again, question, where are they getting communication from our church? Where are they hearing the messages? Is it from each other? Is it just from their theology teachers? If they go to a Catholic school, obviously, which is not everybody. So we have to think about where they're getting their messages from and communicating. So.
Yeah, question in the back there.
So we're talking a lot about experience with young people, and talking about what Father said here is why are so few young people going to the discerning the devotional life. And I think a lot of it, and even leaving religion as a whole, why are they doing this? And I think a lot of it has to do with negative experiences, for one, or lack of positive, meaningful experiences. So if you can't explain to it, or articulate to a young person why faith is relevant, then they're not going to have an interest in it. And then on top of that, I think, to use an example, how many young people that have bad experiences with police officers want to in turn be a policeman? So how many people that are young have bad experiences with religious people want to grow up and be a religious person? So I think it's important as educators or leaders of the church, priests, nuns, etc., is to expose young people to an experience that's positive in regards to faith.
Let's talk about police brutality.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Time for maybe one more question from the audience, and then, yeah, Brian.
Sure. So and I know that we've talked around various points in this question, but I'm hoping that you guys can answer it. I'm interested to hear what you have to say about a direct answer to this. So I'm a professor here, and somewhat past the millennial age, although I qualify under your definition, I'm proud to say. But I've heard about kind of the need to provide a witness, right, and an example. And I think a lot about how to be an authentic, not only how to be a good example, but how to be perceived as one, right? Obviously, those are two different things. And so I'm curious about your thoughts about not only how to be a good example and be a good witness for the faith to young people, but to be perceived as one as well.
That's a really good question. Sometimes I ask myself, like who gets to decide what talk is engaging? Is it me, or is it the teen? And I want to say the teen.
It's
Like,
the teen.
who gets to decide? And then like that's a question that I ask myself every time I step into the classroom. It's like, I have something that I want to say, and I have a lived experience that I want to communicate. But man, how do you communicate the expansive, mysterious, like merciful love of God? You know? And you got to get creative, I think. So perception is huge. Like when I think about like communication, like when I say something, what do I think, or how do I think this teen is going to perceive it? Like I had a moment today where I said something like, dang, like that was not it, you know? That wasn't it. And I literally thought it was a really good answer. Because like he started talking, and then I was like, oh, just wait, I got something, you know? And then I saw his face, he shut down, and like, that wasn't it, you know? And then I think it's this continual like dying to the ego of like what I want to say and what will be received. If it's not received, it's not received. I forget what theologian it is. It's like, but I still remember because it was so startling. An unheard gospel is a dead gospel. Like maybe that's our missionary call, is to figure out creative ways to make sure God's love is perceived, felt, heard, known.
I think that's the very question that Pope Francis is asking and wants us to ask too. And I think the way he answers it is in his apostolic exhortation, the joy of the gospel. And he says that the witnesses the church needs are people who are full of joy. And I think that's the best example that you could possibly give, that responds to the question of why should I believe, that responds to the question of why should I discern a vocation to religious life or priesthood, that responds to the question of why should be a good person in a troubled world. So I think joy is the example we have to set, and young people can pick up on that. They know when somebody is authentically living from the joy of their vocation and their faith.
Well, on that note, I think that's a wonderful place to end this part of the conversation. So join me one last time in thanking our panelists for their honesty and their courage in coming here and talking about these things with you. So thanks.
Thank you.